If I were to ask you what the purpose of an augment in TFT is, what would you say? A lot of things may come to mind, but at the end of the day, there's only one answer that is universally true, and it's easy to take for granted. And no, if you looked at my match history and assumed it was to lose LP, you're wrong. Every augment in the game, from the littlest weeny silver augment to the biggest, buffest prismatic augment, wants to accomplish a single thing. They want to make your board stronger. It might not always be immediately, it might not always be the thing that will make your board the strongest in the long run, but at their core, every augment you take wants to make your board stronger. The difficulty with understanding what augments are good and what augments are bad doesn't actually come from knowing whether an augment is good or bad in a vacuum. It comes from understanding whether or not an augment is good or bad in your specific spot, as well as how good or bad it is. The number one way to get better at selecting augments is to get better at understanding your spot. The term spot in TFT is thrown around super casually, and at its core can be understood simply as the situation you're in. The issue with putting it so simply, however, is just how much depth and nuance goes into really understanding the situation you're in, even as early as stage 1. In a game of TFT, you have, at all times, an incredible amount of information at your disposal that can, and really should, be informing the decisions you make. Two of these pieces of information are things from which many players draw the vast majority of their decision making, those being their understanding of the meta and their own resources. A player will look at the stats for a comp, decide that the bow on their bench is enough to hard commit to it, and say, "Me Zeri" in all chat before promptly muting themselves. Similarly, the same player might hear on a stream or video that a particular hero augment is busted, and decide that seeing it on 2-1 is enough of a high roll to commit to it. These two aspects of the game are 100% very important parts of deciding how you should play a game of TFT, but only relying on them will lead to a frustrating lack of agency in your games that can leave you feeling like Mortdog hit the big red button and said, "No fun for you this game." Maybe the hardest part about recognizing and fixing an inclination to over-index on these two pieces of information is that some games will go really, really well, and hard committing early is the right decision. Understanding not just what resources you have and which comp they match most, but also what your opponents are playing, when they can be strong, when you can be strong, how when you can be strong interacts with when they can be strong, how what they're playing should affect what you're playing, etc., is the key to making consistently good decisions that will smooth out your game. Suffice it to say that there are a ton of things to be looking at and considering when making any decision in a game, especially augment selection. And I'm sure I'll make a video that's more focused on them all at some point. But the really important idea to take from this whole conversation is that you should always be looking for more reasons to make or decide against a decision. A person who makes a decision because they have 100 reasons to, and a person who makes the same decision for a single reason might end up having the same result in that one instance, but over hundreds and thousands of games, the player making more informed decisions will always find more room to play. Generally speaking, the most powerful augments are the ones which come with the biggest drawbacks. Every augment has a drawback. This one especially, holy shit. But not every augment's drawback is as obvious. While some have glaring downsides, like this one not letting you put 3 items on a unit, or this one also not letting you put 3 items on a unit, others have their downsides evident in more abstract aspects. Take, for example, this Cyberboss augment, which is crazy strong. It doesn't explicitly state any particular downside. It won't like blow up your board or something in exchange for all the power it's giving. But what it does do is limit your breadth of play to an extreme degree. If you take it, you have to play Cyberboss units on your board, or else it's totally worthless. What people refer to as generic combat augments, something like one of these, maybe, give less power, but leave more room to play around whatever it is you might end up high rolling. They do, however, still want to be played around in particular ways that can be taken advantage of as long as you know how to lean into them. For example, this augment gives value to your whole board and speeds up the fight a bit. So playing around a single hypercarry rather than a board where everyone chips in, maybe something like Exotech or like a legendary soup in set 14, wouldn't be playing to the augment's strengths. People love taking augments that hard commit them to particular meta lines on 2-1 because it makes the game simpler and gives the chance for a really obvious way to cap their board as long as they hit the corresponding complementary resources. In the case of this Cyberboss augment, Vagar 3, Kobuko, and good items for Vagar. Hard committing is correct in two cases. The first being that you already have enough of the resources lined up for the line the augment wants you to play, that you are already heavily considering playing it. And the second being that something is just grossly overpowered, and you're uncontested or in a much better spot than contesters. Taking augments that don't hard commit you to a particular line on 2-1, but rather just a particular style of fight, make for a more complex game, but also leave you with more agency to play around whatever it is that you might high roll. This focus on simplifying and committing your games is so pronounced that this guy once flamed me for taking a generic combat augment on 2-1 in a tournament that he was hosting. I proceeded to win the game because I was able to capitalize on a mid-game high roll that would have been otherwise inaccessible, and I did go on to win the tournament too. Now that we've broached how every augment does have a downside, we can start to approach how to figure out which augment is the strongest in any spot. Pretty simply, the strongest augment in most spots will be the one with the smallest downside. Okay, so that sounds pretty straightforward and kinda dumb when put like that. Based on what we just talked about, that would mean everyone should just be clicking non-committal generic augments on 2-1, which they kind of are in the form of Econ Augments, but we'll talk about those shortly. But the important consideration here is actually the first thing we talked about and mentioned briefly in the context of Cyberboss in this section, your spot. Your spot is incredibly important context for figuring out how much of a downside any given augment has. In regards to augments with really obvious downsides, like these that we talked about earlier, it can be as simple as recognizing that your items actually don't want to be on the same unit. Say you have a Warmogs and a Deathblade or something. So the downside of not being able to itemize units past a single item isn't really an issue. In regards to augments whose downside is that they hard commit you to playing a certain thing, the downside is alleviated the more likely you already were to be playing that thing. The most obvious example of this is in the Trainer Golem portal, where everyone gets a bunch of emblems for free at the start of the game. The strongest augments in this portal, by far, are the emblem augments. If you have Anima emblem on your training dummy already, you are probably going to be forced to play Anima anyways. So the emblem augment is a significant amount of immediate power and potential power with literally no downside. The correlation between a great player's ability to understand what it is they're likely playing in a game based on the information they've gathered from the lobby and their meta read, their understanding of their spot, and the augments they've picked is why we see so many players at the highest level commit to lines early. Not to say that it is the only way to play at the highest level. It's also why lobbies that end with a prismatic augment on 4-2 can feel so volatile, as by that point, you're already very committed to what it is you're playing, and missing an augment that bolsters that can lead to you free-falling out of nowhere. Your 2-1 augment selection will be the most defining resource in any game of TFT, setting the tone for your board and establishing what it is you're trying to play for. Making sure that the resources following it, whether they be augments or items or units, match it, is the most important part of making a smooth game. I'll be honest, I kind of wrote myself into a corner here with the transition into the next section. So here's a quick drawing I made of Timo eating a bowl of soup, and just pretend that this was a good transition, okay? Also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I would really appreciate it if you did. It helps me keep making videos, and if you're interested in any kind of coaching, make sure to check out my Medify link in the description below. Bonus points if you can guess what kind of soup it is. Okay, I want to approach something that I've kind of been treating as a sort of TFT brain rot that's popped up recently, particularly in regards to augments. This is the distinction in decision making around econ augments and combat augments. Very often, I'll see players say that they or another have too much econ in their augments and that's why they're losing or in a precarious position. Going back to the very first concept covered in this video, all any augment is really meant to do is give your board power. Econ augments are interesting in that rather than giving immediate power, they're an investment in the future of your board, most of the time. Basically, if you have an econ augment, your board should be more expensive than other boards in the lobby at some point. Oftentimes, players think that taking multiple econ augments is going to ruin their game, when in reality, you can definitely take multiple econ augments in your game and do well, as long as the gold you get is reflected on your board. I think the situation this happens the most in is when a player feels directionless in their early game and decides to click econ augments, a trend which is very prevalent at the time this video is being made, and which is super reasonable. Econ augments fall into that generic augment category we mentioned earlier, where they won't hard commit you to anything in particular, but do want to be played around in a specific way. In the same way that Ascension wants you to make a long fight, or this thingy wants you to play a fast fight, Econ Augments are most effective when you can get to a board that wins through sheer unit quality. This can be seen in two ways generally, those being boards with a lot of 5 costs on them, or boards with multiple 3-star units on them. This can also be seen in using Econ to level up aggressively early. If you're level 5 because you got an Econ Augment, and someone else is level 4, your Augment is just a Tactician's Crown. Properly using gold to make your board stronger is significantly harder than using augments that give immediate combat power, as it takes proactivity and an understanding of the lobby's tempo to properly time your spikes and make sure you don't fall behind before you cap. Essentially, if you're taking Econ Augments just to hard force a meta line from a bad or mediocre spot, you're going to get bad or mediocre results. If you're taking one, then using a meta line you're high rolling pieces of to reach a board state in which you have expensive pieces, such as being level 9 with 5 costs, then you'll succeed. This is especially true when taking multiple Econ Augments. Taking multiple is not bad, it just means you should be playing for a board that can properly utilize that much gold. All this isn't to say that you can't take Econ Augments and play around 4-cost boards that don't necessarily have the most room to cap, but more so that when you take an Econ Augment, you have to be hyper aware of where you can fit more gold onto your board if you want to keep up with combat augments. Don't be too overeager to take one just because you have the other. Make sure to think about it. Recently, all of the statistics surrounding augments were banned, leaving many players lost as to what actually makes an augment good or bad. If you're one of those players, or even if you're not, asking yourself more questions about what your augments want you to do, how to lean into what it is they excel at, and how to alleviate their downsides will make augment selection smoother and more correct. Unless you pick something that's bugged, then you're probably screwed.